Um, Thank you very much, Chairperson, as also Professor Mahalakshmi and her entire team for having made this occasion possible. Also, thanks to the members of the Indian History Congress Executive Committee, because organizing this kind of a session in an absolutely unprecedented situation is really an achievement that we need to all recognize. Having said that, I would also hope that we do manage to revive the actual physical History Congress very soon, because I was just thinking back to last year when many of us were in Kannur. And of course, one misses the informal discussions between sessions, the meals, which were absolutely fabulous, also the kind of friendly chaos that is very much part of the History Congress. And one does hope that 2021 will be a better year for all of us. So with that, I'd like to begin the presentation. If we can have the PowerPoint on, please. I'd just like to mention that I've changed the title a little bit and have focused centrally on the figure of Vidura from the Mahabharata. And the reasons for doing that will probably become more clear as we go along. Now, the concept of civilization, like many others that we commonsensically took for granted, is at once amorphous and multivalent. Often considered synonymous with the pinnacle of achievement, artistic, cultural, scholarly, it has increasingly come to be interrogated by people who have been marginalized by those who claim to be the custodians of civilization. From these perspectives, civilizations and their so-called achievements provide the veneer for stratified hierarchical societies. And one of the challenges that for us at the present juncture is to engage with these perspectives. So what follows is one attempt at such an engagement. The next one. Now, one of the most complex, if not contentious categories associated with Indian civilization is dharma, not surprising given the centrality of the term in several subcontinental traditions. The range of meanings the term has acquired is evident even if one examines one of the most accessible dictionaries, V.M. Apte's Practical Sanskrit English Dictionary, where 4 printed columns and very closely printed ones are devoted to dharma and its derivatives. Simplifying this complexity is virtually impossible, and it's perhaps unnecessary. What I propose to do instead is to reflect on the praxis of dharma as represented in the Mahabharata, which is itself a demanding and dense text, through the figure of Vidura, who is thought to embody dharma. A word about the Mahabharata. As is well known, it was composed and compiled over centuries, receiving its final shape probably around the 4th or 5th centuries of the Common Era. Attributed to Vyasa, it is set in and around the Ganga-Yamuna Doab. The narrative was evidently disseminated through several modes of communication, oral, written, and visual. Dealing with a fratricidal struggle between cousins, the Kauravas and Pandavas, ending in the victory of the latter, it is at once prolix and profound. Vidura's location within the narrative is unique. He is the 3rd son of Vyasa, born of a serving woman. He remains loyal to Dhritarashtra and his clan of Kauravas, even as his sympathies lie with the Pandavas. Vidura appears and intervenes at crucial moments in the narrative, especially where kingship and kinship are at stake. However, unlike most of the other protagonists who assume dramatic roles in a story that is preoccupied with warfare, he is a pacific, liminal figure whose social status remains nebulous. Does this permit the expression of views that would otherwise seem problematic? And do they contain possibilities for redefining dharma in particular, and by extension, civilization? Is there a connection between the contents of dharma and the modes of communication used to expound it? In attempting to open up these questions, I draw on the Adi, Sabha, Udyogas, Tri, and Ashrama Vasika Parvans of the Mahabharata, based on the Sanskrit text as reconstructed in the critical edition. The next one. The next slide, please. Yeah. At the outset, let us note that the term used for civilization at present in several Indian languages, could we have the previous one, please? Sorry. Sabhyata has very tenuous roots in Sanskrit. Turning again to Apte, Sabhyata is defined as politeness, good manners, or breeding, while Sabhya refers to one who belongs to a Sabha. The Sabha itself, probably a more or less inclusive assembly, and the Sabha in the Mahabharata we can see is a site of competition, conflict, and disruption. Is an alternative understanding possible? Consider the definition of the Sabha provided by Vidura in the course of one of his typically long speeches. A Sabha does not qualify as one if there are no elders present. Neither does it qualify if the elders do not speak on the basis of dharma, nor is it a sabha if dharma is not based on satya or truth. And finally, that which is based on deception or chala cannot be considered as truthful. What is interesting about this definition is that no markers of social status apart from age are considered important. What is emphasized instead are ethical norms expected to characterize the ideal sabha. The next one. In what follows, we will explore the context of dharma, dharmic dialogues, the expression of dissent, dharma in practice, and the afterlives of Vidura. The next one. Vidura appears in the very first chapter of the Mahabharata, which mentions three fire-like Agni Iva Kauravas produced by Vyasa in the kshetra, that is in the wives or the women associated with Vichitravirya. They are introduced as Dhritarashtra, Pandu, and Vidura. Vidura, the youngest, is at once greater and lesser than his siblings. We learn that he is Dharma incarnate, destined to be reborn in a Shudra Yoni for having permitted the wrongful killing of a Brahmana named Animandavya. Vidura's status is thus unique, fraught, and ambiguous. It is worth bearing this in mind in considering his expositions of dharma. The Adi Parva provides a long description of an ideal realm at the time of the birth of the three sons of Vyasa. The realm included the Kuru Jangala, Kurukshetra, so it's a combination of the wilderness and the agrarian lands, and the Kurus, the inhabitants, all of which prospered. Prosperity is defined in terms of abundant harvests, timely rainfall, trees full of flowers and fruit. Animals, both domesticated and wild, were happy. The cities were full of vaniks and shilpins, that is, merchants and artisans. People were brave, learned, peaceful, and happy. There were no dasyus or robbers, nor were people interested in adharma. Indeed, it seemed as if it was the Krita Yuga, the first and best age of human existence. The people were also free from pride, anger, and greed. And rivaling the mythical Uttara Kurus, who were conceived of as inhabitants of the lands beyond the Himalayas, these southern Kurus walked in the company of the Siddhas, the Charanas, and the Rishis. There were no misers or widows in that Janapada. The absence of misers would point to the prevalence of what was considered of generosity, while the absence of widows would indicate that it was an idyllic domestic world. The houses of the Brahmanas were prosperous, and it seemed as if there were festivities all the time. Give and eat were the words constantly heard everywhere in all the houses. The Pauras as well as the Janapadas, that is the residents of town and country respectively, were happy with the activities of the Kumaras. The usage of the last term, that is the Kumaras, in the plural is significant, suggesting that it was a common designation including all the three sons of Vyasa. The Praja were engaged in dana or making gifts. They were dharmasila, virtuous in the pursuit of dharma. They were performing various yagyas and vratas and regarded one another with affection. The realm governed by Bhishma, according to the Shastras, and contained hundreds of chaityas and yupas. The terminology is interesting, pointing to the prevalence of both non-Vedic and Vedic practices, the former represented by the chaityas and the latter by the sacrificial post or the yupa. People from other realms thronged to this idyllic kingdom where Bhishma had set the Dharma Chakra in motion. The vocabulary has resonances with early Buddhism, where, as is well known, the first teaching of the Buddha is known as the Dhammacakka Pavattana. The city itself resembled a great ocean with its gateways and buildings. Besides, there were rivers, forests, groves, tanks, ponds. There were wells, aramas, sabhas, public spaces, and facilities in general were abundant. The realm is thus visualized as a differentiated space in terms of the landscape and those who inhabit it, with diverse ritual beliefs and practices and differences in social status, occupations, etc. At the same time, there is a sense of coexistence, a sharing of resources, and a pervasive notion of well-being. What is also noteworthy is that the realm is ordinary rather than spectacular. It is not encumbered by florid descriptions of palaces or even of heroic warriors. The next one. It is the kingship of this idyllic realm that becomes a matter of contention. We learned that Bhishma brought up all the three, that is Dhritarashtra, Pandu, and Vidura, as his own sons. They were all versed in the Vedas and Niti Shastras. Of the three, Pandu was well versed in archery. Dhritarashtra was renowned for his strength, while none surpassed Vidura in the knowledge of Dharma Niti. Yet, Dhritarashtra is not considered a suitable candidate for kingship because of his lack of vision. Neither is Vidura on account of his birth. At the same time, Bhishma relies on and consults Vidura when he arranges marriages for the young men to ensure the continuity of the lineage. Vidura's own marriage and children are mentioned in passing. We are informed that a certain King Devaka had a Parashava daughter born of an Anuloma union between a Brahmana man and a Shudra woman. And this woman was Rupa Yovana Sampanna, endowed with beauty and youth. Bhishma arranged the marriage which yielded putras who inherited the qualities of their father. However, neither the wife nor the sons are heard of subsequently. Vidura's private life, it seems, was not spectacular, and there are none of the complexities that overwhelm the lives of his older siblings in terms of sexual encounters and problems of reproduction. As such, not being a contender or a claimant to the throne, or indeed to social status, Vidura's interventions are marked by personal detachment as well as a concern for the wider issues at stake. Not being a king or even an obvious grihastha seems to provide space for engaging in dialogue and ensures a degree of autonomy, distance, as well as perspective. The resolutions he offers are shaped by his location. In fact, where other epic figures are routinely compared to lions, tigers, or bulls, animals symbolic of physical prowess or valor, Vidura is referred to as Dharmartha Kushala, Dhiman Medhavi, skilled in his understanding of dharma and artha, wise and intelligent. His other attributes include being free from lobha and krodha, greed and anger respectively, as well as being Dirghadarshan or far-sighted. The next one. One of the longest elucidations of the ideas attributed to Vidura occurs in the Udyoga Parvan, where he provides an elaborate description of the Pandita. This definition does not rest on knowledge of textual traditions, but rather on a set of practices stemming ideally from a position of detached engagement. A range of qualities is highlighted. These include self-awareness, effort, and forbearance, not being perturbed by anger, joy, or pride. In other words, the emphasis is on equanimity. More pragmatically, the Pandita is also someone who is able to act in secret without fear of heat or cold, without attachment, and without concern for prosperity or adversity. Other qualities include a quick grasp of things, the ability to listen, a focused concern, not being troubled by troubles, and not moved by either praise or insult. He is Tattvagya, that is possessed of knowledge about all bhutas or creatures, Yogigya of all karmas, that is, he knows how the connection between acts, and Upayagya, versed in the means whereby all Manushyas or people can attain their objectives. He is also able to speak with clarity, Pravrittavak, on a variety of subjects, Chitrakatha, with a knowledge of the process of argumentation, possessed of intellect, able to understand the content of books. His understanding of the Shrutis is guided by Pragya, and his Pragya is shaped by the Shrutis. This is followed by a passage which describes the characteristics of the fool or the mudha. Now, amongst other things, the foolish man is one who, though wealthy, eats alone and does not distribute food or clothing amongst his dependents. Other acts that are condemned include taking the wealth of another, entering into the relationships with the wives of another, abandoning one's well-wishers. In other words, sharing and recognizing one's obligations towards others are emphasized as valuable attributes. This is extended to define the ideal Grihastha Dharma in terms of looking after those who may have been marginalized, including the old, kinfolk, those of the Kula who are in a state of decline, the poor Sakha, and the childless sister. Not surprisingly, there is an acceptance of Brahmanical ideals. However, there are also interesting variations. For instance, we find the following, a list of people to whom hospitality is to be offered, which includes the Devas, the Pitris, the Manushyas, the Bhikshus, and the Atithis. Now, the first three are generally mentioned in texts like the Dharma Sutras and the Grihya Sutras, but the introduction of the Bhikshus is an interesting change, which probably represents an acknowledgement of diverse renunciatory traditions, as is the mention of the Atithi or the guest. And also noteworthy is that there is no way in which this list of hospitality is connected with the Varna order. So there is some difference that we can see over there. Vidura's speeches also contain advice on Raja Dharma, and amongst other things, the king is advised to tend his subjects like a gardener to ensure that fruits ripen, seeds are stored, to assure that there is a constant supply of resources. Also important are the qualities that Vidura extols. These include kshama or forgiveness, which along with vidya or learning, ahimsa, non-violence, are considered to be the best of qualities. What is also interesting is that Vidura is associated with redefining the understanding of strength. So we are told that violence or himsa is the strength of the wicked, of the asadhu. The strength of the Raja lies in Danda Vidhi, strength of women lies in service, strength of the virtuous lies in forgiveness. In another instance, we have reference to 5 different kinds of strength, of which again, Bahubalam or physical strength is regarded as the lowest. Above that is the wisdom of the good minister. Then you have wealth. Then you have ancestry. But the best form of strength is supposed to be wisdom. That is the pragya balam. We also notice that there is an emphasis on Shila, virtues, which is considered to ensure victory everywhere, unlike more ephemeral external accessories like clothes or having a vehicle or having cattle wealth, etc. So obviously, material wealth is considered to be less valuable than those attained through the practice of virtue. A similar value is attributed to arjavam or straightforwardness, which is supposed to be better than bathing in all the tirthas. In other words, ritual practices and material resources are regarded as relatively less valuable than the internalization and practice of virtues. Elsewhere, the attributes that lead to prosperity are identified as dhriti, that is endurance or forbearance, shama, quietude, dhamma, control, shaucham or purity, karunyam or compassion, words that are not harsh or cruel and not going against one's friends. The next one. Now, many of the speeches that are attributed to Vidura have entered into or were probably derived from a relatively accessible register of Sanskrit, best exemplified by the verses that were anthologized as the Subhashitas, literally the well said. And I've just put up one or two examples of that. Tyajet ekam kulasyarthe gramasyarthe kulam tyajet, gramam janapadasyarthe atmarthe prithvyam tyajet. So roughly translated, it would be one should forsake the individual for the welfare of the kula for the grama for the janapada, and in order to save one's soul, one should sacrifice the entire earth. And again, the next one, which is basically advising the king, telling the king that you will find people who will say what is pleasing, but to find somebody who will say what is unpleasant and true is both the listener and the sayer of such sayings are rare. The next one. Now, at another level, there are also verses that resonate virtually verbatim with those from the Bhagavad Gita. And again, I've just put up two examples, both very well known. And one can then see that this is in line with the general tenor of Vidura's elucidation of dharma, advocating as it does giving up of kama, that is desire, krodha, anger, and lobha or greed. Now, given that Vidura uses words to achieve his ends, the following statement, which is also attributed to him, is interesting. It says that while the wounds caused by arrows and axes may heal, those caused by harsh words are virtually impossible to heal. At the next one. At the same time, Vidura himself uses words to heal. And this is perhaps best exemplified in the Strī Parvan, where he tries to console Dhritarashtra, who had lost all his sons and close associates in the fratricidal war. Here, once again, one notices that the arguments resonate with those of the Bhagavad Gita, as well as with Buddhist ideas of death. There is an emphasis on jnana, knowledge, as a means of assuaging grief. Ideas that have parallels with the Bhagavad Gita include those pertaining to the unknowability of the beginnings and endings of living creatures. A second set of arguments pertains to the idea of death in the battlefield being an ideal for the brave. Also resonating with the Gita is the notion of the sharirin, or the soul, giving up the body just as people discard the use of clothes. A third set of arguments suggests that kala, time, death, again a term having several meanings, pursues all without differentiating and with a degree of impartiality. A fourth idea is that there is no escape from one's karma, which pursues one relentlessly, whether one is lying down, standing, or running. Death is also described as a leveler, reducing the kulina and the akulina, those with the family and those without, to an identical status, with the cremation ground as a space where the dead sleep, losing their skin and flesh, while the bones hang loosely as the sinews are worn out. Other ways of overcoming the fear of death that are suggested include pursuing the Shilas of Dhamma, Tyaga, and being Apramatta. The emphasis is on abstention and a clear and unperturbed mind. There are other vivid images that Vidura also invokes. These include a detailed analogy between the human body and a pot in the making. It may break while on the wheel, while it is being shaped, or removed from the wheel, while wet or dry, while being fired, while being removed from the kiln. The fate of the embodied being is similar. Death pursues one from the moment of conception onwards, and given its inevitability, grief is futile. The next one. Apart from these general statements, which may have been part of a popular worldview, Vidura's interventions in the narrative are marked by a persistent strand of dissent. More often than not, it is couched in terms of an inclusive reiterating of his positions through analogies and arguments intended to preserve the lineage to which he was bound through bonds of affection rather than through biology. Very rarely does it degenerate into outright hostility or anger. So one of the first appearances of Vidura is during the birth of Duryodhana. It is Vidura who raises the alarm when Dhritarashtra invites him to interpret the ominous sounds that accompanied the event. Predicting that Duryodhana would prove destructive for both the Kula as well as for Kshatriyas, he advises the king to abandon him. In fact, he is constantly concerned with the well-being of the Kurus. Typically, he is Kurunamcha Hiterata, engaged in ensuring the welfare of the Kurus. It is this inclusive concern with the welfare of the entire clan that explains his consistent opposition to Duryodhana. He supports his position on the basis of the qualities of the Pandavas, who are supposed to be endowed with all the gunas. At another level, he reiterates the importance of ties of kinship. In fact, what Vidura asks of Dhritarashtra repeatedly is that he should treat the Pandavas like his sons so that they would in turn reciprocate, treating him like their father. It is the power of the united clan that is idealized here and elsewhere, where Vidura assures Dhritarashtra that his sons, Karna and the 5 Pandavas, are capable of ruling the entire earth up to the seas and the skies. Even as Dhritarashtra acknowledges that Vidura's advice is in accordance with wisdom, he refuses to abandon his son because he is attached to him. Vidura persists, advising him to look after the welfare of his Gyatis or kinfolk who deserve protection, even if they are devoid of virtue, and much more if they are virtuous. He suggests that the Pandavas who desired his blessings would be happy if they received the villages in question, and that acceding to their request would enhance his fame. Destroying Gyatis is undesirable. Instead, if one is united with one's Gyatis, and what is recommended is some bhojanam, some kathanam, and some priti, sharing food, words, and affection, that would lead to prosperity. The good Gyati is indeed a source of protection, enabling one to cross through life, while the bad Gyati causes a person to sink. These arguments are bolstered through the use of analogies. An interesting analogy is that of tigers in a forest. The sons of Dhritarashtra are compared to the forest, the sons of Pandu to the tigers. And it is said that just as the forest cannot survive without tigers, so too tigers cannot survive without the forest. Each needs the other. However, there are other analogies which are not so much of coexistence. So the sons of Dhritarashtra are compared to creepers and the Pandavas to the Shala tree. Also, the Pandavas are regarded as trees that can set the forest on flame because they have fire within them. Overall, we can see that Vidura is undeterred by the vacillations of Dhritarashtra and continues to attempt repeatedly to persuade him to adopt an impartial attitude towards his sons and nephews. Dhritarashtra is represented as being torn between the wise, if unpalatable, advice offered by Vidura and his emotional attachment to his son. When the news of Draupadi's Swayamvara reaches the royal court, Vidura advises reconciliation rather than conflict, recognizing an inclusive kinship network in which the Pandavas ought to be considered as sons, as we've just seen. His second argument is pragmatic, highlighting the strength and prowess of the Pandavas and the futility of opposing them. He also draws attention to the strength of their allies, including Drupada and Krishna. This ideal of reconciliation rather than confrontation is also what leads Vidura to try and prevent the game of dice. In this context, Vidura again approaches Dhritarashtra as a brother and urges him not to create bheda or differences between his putras. Dhritarashtra places Vidura's arguments before Duryodhana, describing Vidura as a brother whose shasana or instructions he tends to follow. However, Duryodhana has no faith in Vidura and accuses him of being partial to the Pandavas. In the dicing hall itself, Vidura intervenes time and again, attempting to prevent the imminent destruction and disruption of the entire world that he values. He addresses Dhritarashtra, comparing him to a dying man refusing medicine. He minces no words in describing Duryodhana as Kulagna, somebody who is destroying the lineage. And he bolsters his argument with certain analogies, etc. Ultimately, this argument degenerates into a kind of slanging match between Vidura and Duryodhana and ends on that note. By the time we come to the Udyoga Parva, you can see that Vidura will be overruled, but nonetheless, Dhritarashtra invites him once again and asks him for his advice. And towards the end of that discourse, Vidura suggests that he should listen to a Brahmin instead and invites Sanat Kumara. Of course, Sanat Kumara is as unsuccessful as Vidura in preventing what seems to be almost foreordained to happen. The next one. Now, beyond his several speeches, we find Vidura acting in several cases, not as a warrior, but as a messenger, often at the behest of Dhritarashtra, but also on his own. Some of these occasions are when he is referred to as a subservient administrative personnel, the Kshatri or the Chamberlain. And on other occasions, one can see that he either intervenes or abstains on his own terms. So when the Pandavas marry Draupadi, he takes the initiative to persuade Dhritarashtra to invite them. And then again, when he's asked to invite the Pandavas for the game of dice, he does so, but does so reluctantly. However, when Duryodhana asks him to summon Draupadi, Vidura refuses to do so and warns him about the dangers of doing that. Duryodhana accuses him of being a bhiru or a coward and then sends an attendant who does the needful. Again, in the Sabha, as we have seen, Vidura intervenes in Draupadi's defense, describing her as somebody who is without a lord or a protector, and saying that if in the Sabha dharma is tortured, then the supplicant who is already in flame would be able to destroy. It is the duty of the members of the Sabha, the Sabhyas, to extinguish the fire on which is burning her. He also adds that it is the duty of the Sabhyas to respond without giving way to kama and krodha, that is desire and anger. And he again puts in a little narrative to strengthen the idea. But his interventions evoke no response. Instead, Karna insists that Draupadi should be treated as a Dasi, and Dushasana proceeds to act on his words. Vidura intervenes yet again, and this is a pragmatic warning saying that Bhima's rage will be something which will be destructive. We also see Vidura intervening to prevent the burning of the Pandavas in the House of Black, where he uses two interesting strategies. One is he uses a Mleccha Bhasha to converse with Yudhishthira, and he is the one who sends in the somebody who is a friend who digs the tunnel through which the Pandavas escape. Now, and when finally we find that Dhritarashtra decides to renounce the world, Vidura passes on this information to Yudhishthira and accompanies Dhritarashtra as he retires to the forest. The next one. Now, Vidura is also somebody who is responsible for funerals. So when Pandu dies, he's the one who is instructed to perform the Preta Kalyani, that is the rites for the dead, which he duly does. And then at the end of the war, in the Sri Parvan, we learn that he's the one who has the task of performing the last rites for all those who do not have anybody else to do so. But what is also remarkable is Vidura's own end, which is described in the Ashrama Vasika Parva, where Yudhishthira comes to the forest and meets Vidura, who leads him on, and ultimately, leaning on a tree, he fixes his gaze on Yudhishthira. This is a transformatory moment for both of them. Vidura remains transfixed, his life force leaves him and enters Yudhishthira. It appears as if their bodies, their breath, and their senses merge. It's the Gatra, the Prana, and the Indriya that merge. And Yudhishthira acquires Tejas while Vidura remains immobile. What is more, when arrangements are made for his cremation, that is for Vidura's cremation, a voice intervenes. He is not to be burnt, as his body has already been cremated through knowledge and cannot be burnt again. Jnana dagdhasya dehasya punardaho na vidyate. Okay. Vidura's end contains a suggestion of transcending mortality. Beyond the literal meaning is the metaphorical, and beyond these tantalizing possibilities are also contexts of communication. Unlike the more dramatic characters of the epic, Vidura figures in relatively static situations in the Sanskrit epic. In fact, except for the scene in the Sabha Parvan, it is unlikely that the other situations in which he is present would lend themselves to engrossing representations in performative or visual modes. At the same time, we have seen that at least some of what he advises seems to have flowed into and out of a pool of relatively popular verses, which probably circulated widely in early medieval India. Were some of these related to Ashokan ideals of Dhamma? While there are no exact parallels, it is possible that the general idea of a benevolent, inclusive social ethic may have resonated in a variety of ways. The next one. More direct convergences and divergences are opened up in the Jatakas. Here we note the presence of Vidura Pandita in the Jataka bearing the same name. He is described as an Amatya or Amatya and also as an Artha Dhammanu Sasaka. He was renowned for expounding the Dhamma in a sweet and melodious voice, which attracted all the Rajas of Jambudipa. He also successfully adjudicates amongst divine and human kings, including Indra, Garuda, Varuna, and Dhananjaya. Hearing about his reputation, Vimala, the wife of the Nagaraja Varuna, experiences a desire to hear him, but disguises this as a dohada, that is the desire of a pregnant woman for consuming the heart of Vidura. A long narrative rich with folk elements is woven around this quest for and the virtual capture of Vidura. In the course of this, Vidura discloses his identity. When asked whether he is related to Dhananjaya, the king whom he serves, the honest man declares that he is not, but he is rather one of four kinds of dasas, as he was born of a dasa yoni. Apart from his lowly status, which resonates with that of his namesake in the Mahabharata, he is also described as being wise. Therefore, when he has to go with the Yakka Punnaka, who wants to extract his heart to offer it to Vimala, Vidura advises his sons about how to behave with Rajas. In this narrative, Vidura is endowed with 1,000 sons, 1,000 daughters, 1,000 wives, 700 Garnikas, and Dasakamakaras, who are all upset at the idea of his departure. Apart from the fabulous numbers, what is remarkable are the dramatic and vivid descriptions that are inserted. This is particularly true for the various attempts made by Punnaka to engineer the death of Vidura to enable him to extract his heart. When all the attempts to frighten him to death fail, Punnaka decides to kill him by whirling him around. Even as he's being tortured, Vidura realizes why Vimala may have wanted him and decides that it is important to save himself in order to fulfill her desire. In order to achieve this, he proceeds to expound the Dhamma to the Yakka, even as he is suspended head down. Unsurprisingly, this instruction leads to a miraculous transformation in the attitude of the Yakka, who gives up his scheme of destroying the wise man and instead, impressed by him, bathes, clothes, and feeds him. Ultimately, Vidura persuades him to take him to the world of the Nagas, instructs the Naga king as well as Vimala, and returns to instruct his own king and the populace for the rest of his life. What this rich narrative suggests is that the idea of the learned Vidura, a wise man who was assigned low status, was apparently well known and could be adopted and adapted within other traditions and contexts. It also suggests that these memories survived in different locations. It is also interesting that this telling is enlivened by several dramatic moments as Vidura is taken through a rather bumpy ride along aerial routes to his destination. Were these introduced to ensure that the narrative was exciting, so that the relatively staid message of Dhamma could be conveyed interwoven with a gripping adventure? Such strategies may have permitted Vidura Pandita and his message to survive and transcend barriers to communication. Finally, let us return briefly to the recuperation of the yet-to-be-born Vidura in Anamni Angana, literally the woman without a name, a play published in 1960 by Buddhadev Bose. Anamni Angana is the mother of Vidura, the slave woman. According to the Mahabharata, when Ambika, the widow of Vichitravirya, was instructed to welcome Vyasa for sexual intercourse once again, in an attempt to obtain a so-called proper heir for the lineage, Ambika hit on a strategy to escape, substituting herself with a slave woman. Bose reworks this slender reference to create space for a complex and intense reflection on issues of gender, sexuality, caste, kinship, and human values. Ambika strikes a bargain with the slave woman. She will win her freedom once she has performed this task. But in performing her duty, Angana is transformed. She no longer wants her freedom. Instead, she wants to nurture the son who, according to Vyasa, will be wise, gentle, soft-spoken, calm. She is to name him Vidura, as Vidya or learning will be part of his nature. Vyasa also predicts that the forthcoming war and points out that Vidura will be present, but he will work for peace, detached like a swan that is not touched by the waves of the ocean. Angana now wants to live to see this son of hers, who will hold aloft the white flag of peace in the midst of a bloodied earth, gentle, soft-spoken, and calm. The son will be learned like the father and work in the background like his mother. adorned by poverty like his mother, and indifferent to the world like his father, neither a Kshatriya, nor a Brahmana, nor a Shudra, neither friend nor foe, neither trapped in the world nor a renouncer, but immersed in a stable, unfragmented thought, enduring yet distant, a tribute to her memory and her experience. These figures, creations of complex literary traditions, are a reminder of the challenges posed by and to our understanding of civilization. At once located on the margins and implicated in what is more dramatically visible, they open up perspectives that, even as they are framed within the mainstream, rupture it by raising the possibility of a universal inclusive ethic, by an insistence on dialogue and reiteration, by a refusal to endorse resolutions based on force, and by extending humane support even while dissenting. It is perhaps these qualities that we need to turn to and privilege as we attempt to grapple with our understanding of civilization. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rai, for an excellent presentation of what you say, the listening to Vidura. Actually, by general parlance, Vidura is represented as a consistently dharmic person in Mahabharata, but your presentation is very unconventional, and because of this, it is very interesting also. I think there may be some questions on it, but I have one or two questions and observations. First of all, I want to know what is your view of the earlier presentation of Vidura in Iravati Karve's book? This is one thing. Second is this, that your presentation of Vidura from multiple sources, including Buddhadev Bosu's that drama, dramatic thing. So it is represented for a long time, not only in Vidura's time, but also in later times. So how you can locate it with your civilizational account? And I think this is my suggestion, is this, that if you think by this way, that civilization approach is something which is always marked with multiplicity of explanation. And by that way, Vidura becomes a symbol to you to understand civilization. How do you react to it? So these are the three questions. And later on, I think Mahalakshmi will present more questions.
Thank you very much for those questions. I just want to begin by saying that I will not take up the comparison with Iravati Karve's understanding right now, because I have read her work long ago and I didn't get back to it when I was working on this paper. Because partly what I was trying to do is to look at the way in which Vidura figures in the Mahabharata and in the Jataka tradition. And what are the parallels, what are the differences, and how does that work out? That was something that was, because one of the issues that I think happens with many of these narratives is that they flow into and out of different traditions. And that is something important to consider. But I do hope to go back to Karve's account at some point of time and see what one can, how that would figure in. The other thing that I think is important for us to do is that, many of these figures are used very popularly in different contexts to think through certain issues. And I think that looking at Vidura is one way of our opening up, not the only way, but one way of opening up a discussion on the category of dharma from a very different location. So I think that in that sense, it opens up possibilities for us to see what is being understood by dharma dharma, again, not to take it definition, but as one that we need to engage with, because it is coming from the margins. And I think one of the ideas that came up both with Professor Shrimali's presentation and with Professor Selvakumar's presentation, where he mentioned the need for looking at the subalterns, is to look at the way in which civilization as a category might look different once we look at it from a different perspective. So I think that is something which triggered off this looking into Vidura, and also because it's an interesting figure who clearly has a pro-Pandava position, but nonetheless remains constantly loyal to Dhritarashtra. And what is very interesting is that even in the Stree Parvan sequence, when everybody has died and he is consoling him, which one would normally think if one was an author writing, there would be an element of adding in verses which had this sense of, I told you so. But those verses are not there. You know, there's a way in which the figure is being constructed, where he takes the discussion onto a very different philosophical plane. And that is something which is interesting. And the fact that he is supposed to be this wise person who has an extremely liminal status, and he's the one who is being given this voice. It gives us a sense of the complexities that we need to think about when we raise this issue of civilization. So I think that is something that is perhaps significant.
Thank you so much, Professor Roy. Yes, thank you. There are two very interesting questions. One from a BA Honours History student, and one from the president of the archaeology section for the 81st session, Vishnu Priya Basak. I'll start with the BA student's question. Yes. Srishti Ray asks, how does Bhishma's understanding of dharma clash with Vidura's understanding? Can we say that Bhishma's position too was ambiguous, as in spite of being the eldest son, he was bereft of throne, did not marry, did not follow the householder's path, yet had to stay in court, and did not completely renounce family life? And the second question from Vishnu Priya is, could you please say something more on gender relations highlighted through this account of Vidura?
Thank you. Both of them are very interesting questions. Again, to do justice to the question on Bhishma, one would probably have to plow through the entire Shanti Parvan and the Anushasana Parvan, which is something that one would need to do, because that is where you have the discourses that are attributed to Bhishma on the issue of dharma. But in general, one would have a sense that Bhishma's dharma would probably tend to be much more the proclamations of dharma associated with Bhishma would probably be more in accordance with the Varnashrama ideal of dharma than the kind of Jnati-based dharma that seems to come through in Vidura's position, where he's more anxious about the clan being held together and a certain kind of equality amongst the clan that is being emphasized, whereas Vidura's would perhaps be much more in the line of the Raja Dharma, Varnashrama Dharma, which we would find in the Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras. But it certainly requires much more scrutiny to give a detailed response to that, and it is something which is worth thinking about, and the specifics of that. Now, the other thing, of course, about the other differences that one can notice is that in the case of Bhishma, although you are right in pointing out that there is this element of celibacy, there is the element of avoiding kingship, etc., at the same time, we can see that Bhishma is also located within the martial tradition. He is recognized as a Kshatriya. And given that this whole epic is so preoccupied with warfare and valorizing the martial, that is something that is, again, a difference between Vidura's position and Bhishma's position. The way in which Bhishma resolves ultimately to act as the first of the generals on the Kaurava side, and that is something which is accepted, is something that is significant. So I think there are those differences which one would need to also look at. So there's a way in which one would need to look through the narrative tradition to see what are the points in which Bhishma figures, as also to look at the didactic sections where you have these extremely long sections where he expounds on dharma, and to see what are the similarities or differences. There would be similarities, because after all, this is one composite text. We've been talking about composite culture, and in many ways, the Mahabharata exemplifies some of these. Coming to Vishnupriya's question, what's interesting is that the point where you find Vidura taking a stand about issues of gender is in the Sabha Parva, where he is somebody who is anxious that Draupadi should have a fair deal. And he is one of the voices. There are the other person who raises a voice is this relatively unknown son of Dhritarashtra, Vikarna, who also raises a voice at that point. But these are the ones who raise a voice in trying to defend Draupadi. But beyond, but again, that's an interesting conversation, and I didn't go into the details of that narrative. When it comes to the point where Vidura and Duryodhana come to a kind of slanging match, as it were, both of them, the dialogues inserted in the text in their name, both of them take to abusing on the basis of women. So, there is somewhere where you can push the arguments about gender up to a point, and then there is this question about why, when they have to kind of abuse one another, they have to bring in derogatory statements about women, comparing to an unchaste woman, etc., when they want to point out that there is this. So obviously there are certain narrative strategies at work that we need to unpack and see what is the kind of vocabulary available. And that is something that is significant over there. So that's as far as one could go, probably. And of course, even in the points where Vidura, because I was tracking Vidura's statements through the text more carefully, he is not particularly preoccupied in anything that he says with the Pativrata dharma, which again I think ties in with the fact that much of the dharma that is associated with Vidura is not very strongly tied in with the Varnashrama model. So you have that space that is there. And sometimes, of course, the absence of the Pativrata dharma itself is a relief. So if somebody is not kind of advocating that, that can also be seen as something which is an interesting fact, given that you have these very, very long speeches that are attributed to Vidura. So that is something one, again, probably needs to follow up more systematically. But thank